So I always preach on one of the readings appointed for the day. Always, always, always. Well, almost always. So today is an exception. And today I'd like to talk about something that I think is important, but a little unusual. It's the statement by the Pope on artificial intelligence, his first major encyclical letter, as it's called. I'll talk about that in a moment. His first major letter of the social doctrine of the church. It's a letter about justice, social justice, and a letter about a kind of an ethical consideration of the implications of artificial intelligence in our society. So a few reasons for talking about this. One is that any statement by a pope is really, really important. There's more Roman Catholics in the world than all other kinds of Christians combined. He's a leader of the church. He's also one of the few global voices who speaks out and is listened to about ethical considerations. So we've got lots of politicians, we've got lots of corporate leaders making decisions all the time, but they don't generally kind of get involved in a kind of an ethical consideration of what it is they're doing, and say this is what's good and this is what's bad. They usually say this is what's good. So I think it's useful. Now, the Pope's not an Anglican, he's not a Canadian Anglican, but there's not much distance, I don't think, in the social theology of the church between Anglicans and Roman Catholics. I mean, there's diverse views among Catholics and diverse views among Anglicans, but the scope of the discussion and the kind of center of gravity of the discussion is pretty similar, so I think he has a lot to offer us in that. And artificial intelligence is a really significant thing to think about in our world because it's changing, it's already beginning to change, it's going to change more. What kind of jobs there are, what kind of jobs are lost, how employment's structured is going to change and it's already changed. How schooling happens and what teachers will watch out for and how students do their homework. It's important for, obviously, communication, especially in the way it can kind of contribute to fraud and fake statements that can't be discriminated from true statements. That's going to have a big bearing on how society unfolds. It's also can be a great boon for the criminal element. There's all kinds of things that criminals can do now easily that it used to be harder to do or less, where they could be less convincing. So I think this is an important statement for that reason. I wanted to kind of talk about it. Oh, I got this thing here. Let me just. Okay, so the name of the encyclical is called Magnifica Humanitas, which is the first two words of the encyclical if it were in Latin. Actually, it was written in English, and it hasn't even been translated into Latin, but the convention over the centuries has been to use a Latin name because Latin used to be the kind of main language of the church. So it means the kind of grandeur of humanity. So this is kind of an unusual way to open up, to title an encyclical. It's talking about the magnificence, the grandeur of humanity. It's talking about how important it is to promote and cultivate and support the right kind of humanity. So it takes a very positive approach to what it is to be a human being. So a couple words about Pope Leo XIV. First of all, it helps to know that he is an Augustinian, which means he's a friar in the Augustinian order, and the Augustinians are people who identify with St. Augustine of Hippo, the great North African bishop and theologian in the late 4th, early 5th centuries. So he was somebody who cared about justice, and the Pope quotes this sentence in his encyclical from St. Augustine. Do you wish to attain peace, then practice justice. So justice is central to, especially one of his main works, St. Augustine's City of God, where he talks about how justice is the main property of the city of God, but not so the human city. The human city is full of people who are after power or are greedy or who kind of look after themselves. So one of the jobs of the church for St. Augustine is to kind of remind people, remind the state, remind citizens of what God wants from society. So this is not the Pope just kind of thinking about some political theory. This is him talking, channeling God's revelation in the Bible. So in the Old Testament, God has what's sometimes called a preferential option for the poor. He tells Israel, you don't need to look after and protect the rich. You don't need to look after and protect the powerful. They can do well for themselves, but you need to look after the widow, the orphan, the stranger in the gate, the homeless, the hungry. And Jesus says the same, that you need to look after the hungry. And the church from the very beginning was doing that, If people were hungry, the Roman Empire didn't say, oh, well, here's, go to the unemployment line or something like that. Christians would go out and they would feed them. If they were sick, Christians would go out and heal them. So the church took upon itself to kind of make society strong and to help people in need. And that was doing justice. So the church says, Augustine says that the state will never be a just place the way the city of God is, but we can make it better. We can remind it of what its obligations are. So as an Augustinian, he is following that path in his very, very first encyclical. And another thing that has motivated him is, in general, he takes the view, which I think is probably true, that in the modern world, we've kind of lost sight of God. Through kind of Christian history, people have said, well, God has created us, God calls us to certain kinds of vocations, God sets down certain kinds of standards for our lives. And now in a society without so much concern for God, it's kind of up to, I don't know what, parliaments or corporations or I don't know who, or individuals to make up their own minds about what they should do. And sometimes they have a way of rationalizing a lot of actions of self-interest and self-aggrandizement. And so the Pope says, yeah, we need to return to what God says about human life and about society. So I've given you a couple of images. The first, the top image, is the famous Michelangelo image of the creation of man. So God is in the cloud and he's touching Adam and giving him life. And the second image, it's probably an AI image actually. It's an image of a human kind of giving life to a robot, I guess. It's the human being who's deciding what the world should be like and getting AI to make the world more the way he wants. So it's not doing what God wants, it's doing what people, and often wealthy people who can afford to run corporations that develop AI, doing what they want. Okay, word about the encyclical. If you were to read it in a book, and I guess you can read it in a book, although I read it from the internet, it would be about 150 pages. And it's updating the social doctrine of the church. The social doctrine of the church means what the church says, what Christian teaching says is the right way to form a just society. And that can change through history. A pre-industrial society may not be organized the same way as an industrial society. A technological, an artificial intelligence technological society may not be organized the same way as something that came before. So it's something that kind of evolves. But in all cases, what the Pope's trying to do, what teachers of theology try to do, is to apply biblical principles to the landscape. The encyclical begins, so encyclical letter is a kind of a class of pronouncement by the Pope, and it's sort of the second level of importance after a papal bull. It's very important, and it's vetted carefully by the establishment, so it's not just him sitting down and writing something. It's, the kind of greatest theologians of the church are kind of checking it and giving him suggestions and so on. So this is something the Anglican Church of Canada can't really do. There aren't a lot of world-class theologians in the Anglican Church of Canada. There are a few. I know some of them. They're there, but there aren't a lot. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church has the resources to do this kind of thing. Anyway, the encyclical begins by tracing the social doctrine of the church and as a kind of what you might call a codification of a certain section of Christian theology. It really begins in 1891 with an encyclical letter by Pope Leo XIII. So when Robert Prevost of Chicago was elected Pope, he had to choose a name by which he would be known as Pope. So he chose Leo XIV. So that was a signal that he wanted to follow in the footsteps of Leo XIII in teaching specifically in this kind of Augustinian way about justice in society. And then he goes on in the letter to kind of talk about successive popes and the Second Vatican Council, and especially his predecessor, Pope Francis, and all that they said about social justice. So he's building on a very important recent modern tradition. So here are the principles, the main principles of the encyclical and of the social doctrine of the Church. And the first of all is the Magnificat Humanitatis, the grandeur of humanity, human dignity. And that's all based on the beginning of Genesis, when God creates Adam in his image and likeness, creates humanity in God's image and likeness. It's a very simple story. It only takes a few verses in the Bible, but it's so significant. And it means that whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, whether you're, whatever your ethnicity or whatever part of the world you're born in, or whatever your income level or whatever, you have an equal human dignity that the Church wants to remind us all of. Secondly, human rights. So along with human dignity comes human rights. So freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, a reasonable right and expectation of being supported by society when you're needy, being clothed and fed and looked after with whatever. We kind of take that for granted now, but it took a long time for society to get after that, even though the Church was kind of thinking about that from the day of Jesus, really. The dignity of work. So work should not be seen, according to the Pope, simply as something we do in order to make money so that we can do something more interesting in our spare time. Work itself has importance. It has dignity. But that goes along with the next point, the common good. Not all work is for the common good. I mean, criminals do work, but they're not doing it for the common good. They're doing it for themselves. So work, to have the dignity it should be something that helps not just individuals doing it or their buddies, but society as a whole. So, people who do medical care in hospitals, people who teach in schools, people who build housing, people who are part of the food chain, people who are making the world livable. It's very important for him to think that human beings are social animals. We don't just live for ourselves. We prosper best when we live in community. That's why the Church is, being part of a church is better than, praying by yourself at home. You got to pray by yourself at home too, but the community is really important in guiding us and supporting us. The resources that God has created, the waterways, the fertile soils, nature and all its diversity and glory, all of that is intended by God for everybody. He calls that the universal destination of goods. It's not just for a few people at the top of a hierarchy. It's for everybody. And so a social doctrine of the Church reminds people that God's resources are intended for the good of everybody. The Church's mission and history refers, by that I mean kind of what I said before, that society evolves and the social doctrine of the Church therefore has to evolve as well. And an example that he uses of that is slavery. So he acknowledges that it was not until the 19th century that the Roman Catholic Church specifically said that slavery is wrong. And it's not because slavery was right before and then became wrong. It was always wrong, but society was just full of slavery and the Church kind of went along with it and made a mistake. The Pope says it made a mistake. We should have spoken out against it centuries earlier, but we didn't. So first of all, he acknowledges error. This is not a usual thing, actually, for churches to say, we made a terrible mistake. Or for a pope to say on behalf of the Church, you made a terrible mistake. This is a news-making thing in itself. Secondly, he says, this just goes to show you how it's important for the Church to keep critiquing itself and examining itself and questioning what it does, because when it doesn't, it just keeps saying slavery is okay. It just keeps saying the same thing over and over again and doesn't realize that it has made mistakes. So I've given just out of this 150 pages or so, I've just given part of one paragraph to give you, I think this kind of summarizes his main point. Artificial intelligence systems can surpass human intelligence in speed and computational capacity, but they do not undergo experiences. They do not possess a body. They do not feel joy or pain. They do not mature through relationships. They don't know from within what love, work, friendship, or responsibility mean, nor do they have a moral conscience, since they do not judge good and evil, grasp the ultimate meaning of situations, or bear responsibility for consequences. So a couple of examples, you go in, 50 years ago, you go into the bank for a loan because you're starting a new business or something like that. And the banker kind of looks at your resources and kind of interviews you and kind of thinks about, are you going to be successful in this business you're proposing? Do you know a lot about it? Is this a need that society has? And says, yeah, I guess we can do that. Or if he says no, he says, I'm really, really sorry. Here's what you can do to make it better. Now, if you go in for a loan, they feed data into, a computer, and out comes the answer, and AI is making the decision, and the loan officer is saying, well, AI says no, sorry. But no one's taking responsibility for that decision. AI doesn't take responsibility, it's just a machine. It doesn't have a relationship with this person that's asking for the loan. That's one example. Another example I've read about several times, you probably have too, is, the police are looking for a criminal, and they have a picture of the criminal. And AI goes through 10 zillion images of people, and they say, Joe Jones in, medicine hat, he's the guy. He looks like the guy that's in the picture. So the police go and say, they arrest him. They say, well, AI said this is the guy. And the guy says, well, I was 1,000 miles away from the crime when it was committed. And they say, sorry, AI says. And they throw him in jail for a couple of months until the lawyer can finally convince somebody that AI made a mistake. And we're already seeing AI mistakes. And people like the Pope are saying, we're going to see more and more mistakes. And who's going to take responsibility? Who's going to make sure that doesn't keep happening? Here we go. Okay, so here are some issues that the Pope sees. First of all, AI can violate human rights without anyone being responsible. So I've given an example of that. AI is not morally neutral. So a pencil is morally neutral. You can use the pencil to write good things. You can use it to write bad things. It's just an object. It's just a piece of very simple technology. AI is not like that because it's programmed by people with certain kinds of priorities to think that certain kinds of things are important and certain things aren't kind of important. And the programmers are probably in their early 20s or something, I don't know. Anyway, AI comes out not morally neutral, but with a whole set of priorities about what's important and what to look for. So it's, by design, it embodies priorities. Third, it's controlled by large corporations for profit, not the common good. So remember that social justice requires work to be done for the common good. But a lot of this work is done for the particular interests of large, wealthy corporations and the wealthy people that control them. It amplifies the power of the powerful, those who are already powerful. I mean, we live in a society which is, compared to the 50s or 60s, 1950s or 1960s, there's a lot of inequality. There's a lot of difference in wealth between the top, less than 1% and the bottom, 70%. There's already inequality, and AI tends to amplify that. Its business models depend on a way of making people addicted to information. So if you've ever been in any kind of public space, you know that 90% of people are checking their phones for the latest, Facebook posting or the social media thing or email or something like that. So that's part of the business model, to make us really kind of want to check to see what's going on and get information which may not actually be information. And it can dehumanize human work, make people, the jobs that are left after AI takes them are either really important jobs where you control a lot of things, that's for a very select few, or it's just menial. And it's great for criminals, who can make fraud look very persuasive. So the Pope ends by two biblical images to just encapsulate what he's saying. The first image is the Tower of Babel story from Genesis 11. And that's a story about how, sometime a few centuries after creation, some really powerful people decide that they are going to build a great tower, which is going to kind of preempt heaven in a way. It's going to be built right up to the heavens, and the powerful people are going to be there, and they're going to control everything, and there's going to be one language. And the Pope says, digital data is like one language. It helps us control things when everybody is controlled by digital data. And so this is the example of the AI corporation, where a small number of people are telling people what to do, what to build, where to work, how to work, so that they, the important people, can rule the entire world. So that's the Tower of Babel. And then he says, by contrast, read the story of Nehemiah. So you remember that Israel was marched off to exile in Babylon in the 5th century BC. And then finally they were released when Persia conquered Babylon, and the Persian emperor said, okay, you guys can go back to Jerusalem. So they go back to Jerusalem, and everything's a mess. The temple has been destroyed, the walls have been destroyed, the houses have been destroyed, it's all been destroyed by the Babylonians. So they got to rebuild. And Nehemiah, who's kind of the leader, doesn't say, okay, you do this, you do that, you do that. He said he kind of gets families together and individuals together and groups together, and he says, let's plan this together. Let's decide where we want the walls to be. What about the temple? The temple is going to be central. It's all going to be built. The whole city is going to be built around the temple of God. It's going to be a godly city. It's going to be a Jewish city. But it's not going to be ruled by a small elite. The design of the city isn't going to be made by a small elite. It's going to be done by all the exile, the post-exilic community as a whole. They're all going to have a say in what's done. So that's the encyclical, and it's a challenge to us to keep in mind the challenges. The Pope briefly acknowledges that there are, of course, some advantages to AI, and I have to say that's not exactly the main interest that he has in the encyclical. There are certainly a lot of advantages in AI, but he's really kind of worried about the possibilities of damage to the fabric of society, to the human character, to the question of justice in society. He's really worried about that. He thinks that's already a worry for us, and he thinks it's going to be more of a worry. And there's really nobody except the religious community, and in particular the church, who has the kind of independence and moral authority to say, that's enough. You're crossing a red line there. We need to do something different. It's up to us to make sure that society doesn't fall into, something catastrophic. So for that challenge that the Lord gives us, I think, through the Pope, for that challenge, and for the kind of confidence that God will support us in giving us the moral standards we need and giving us the guidance that we need to challenge what's wrong. Thanks be to God.